Thanks for checking out today's episode of The Experience Curve, where we explore the personal journeys of accomplished individuals, breaking down the steps they took to get where they are, which I hope just might inspire you on your own path forward. Today, I'm thrilled to have Jim Capobianco, an Academy Award nominee and creative force whose path has left an indelible mark on Disney, Pixar, and now at the helm of Aerial Contrivance Workshop. He's the mastermind behind narratives that not only entertain, but also inspire. In our conversation, we take a cinematic ride through a spectrum of experiences from the iconic to the innovative in Jim's illustrious body of work. We'll explore the many dimensions of his artistic universe, including his latest release and directorial debut, The Inventor. Get ready for a discussion that peels back the curtain on the magic behind animated storytelling, exploring the spectrum of experiences from modern classics to innovative endeavors. This is a journey filled with insights, laughter, and a few surprises as we navigate the exciting career of Jim Capobianco. Hey, Jim, thank you for taking the time today to join me on the podcast. We were connected, obviously, through my wife, Mimi, and, had worked with you on a project before. Just reading your bio and stuff was like, just from like where you grew up to like your career to just things that we have in common, or just looking at your whole career trajectory and what's to come it really blew me away. So I'm really excited and honored you would even do this. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. No, I'm happy to be on your podcast. This is going to be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And I always start like the beginning. We're both from New Jersey. You're Saddlebrook, right?
Right.
I'm down South Jersey on the shore.
hmm
Animation, storytelling, growing up, for me, it was always, doctor, lawyer, when you get older, go to college, get a degree.
Yeah.
But like for you, was there like, influences or maybe experiences that kind of pointed you to this sort, creative, imaginative career that you have?
I grew up in an Italian family, like we were talking about just before we started recording. And it was a big family, and they would tell a lot of stories around the table. And my cousins would all go off and play and run around, but I always wanted to be at the adult table and just listen to these stories being told. And I feel like part of that is maybe why I went into animation storytelling, or it felt like a good fit for me. So that was probably an influence. My mother was a registered nurse, but on the side, her hobby was painting, and she would paint
Mm.
watercolors and oil paintings and would have art shows and stuff. So art was always kind of around me in that way. My sister as well studied, she's 4 years older. She studied illustration in New York at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Yeah, so it just art itself was around me. And then animation, I would watch like everything animated as a kid, like Saturday morning cartoons and then all the holiday specials. And I would, check the TV guide and be like, when is a certain program going to be on? I got to watch it this year again, back in the day,
Yeah, I remember.
So I would watch everything. Even like my dad would be watching a ball game, or he'd go, "Oh, Jimmy, I was his remote control." And he'd be like, "Jimmy, put on the Mets." And I'd like click through the TV channels, and there would be like an animated thing that would pop on, like something on PBS or something. And I would stop there and I'd just start watching it. And then he'd go, come on, go to the Mets. What's going on? So it was always part of my life, but I didn't think I'd go into animation. I got interested in cartooning because at that time, Calvin and Hobbes and Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes, and then The Far Side and Bloom County were all these really great comics at the time, comic strips. And I wanted to do that. That's what I wanted to do. And so I would draw these comics. And then that kind of started to lead towards this idea to do animation. And my sister, like I said, went to School of Visual Arts, and she took an animation course there, and she started talking about it. Then in high school, this was kind of a big turning point for me. I had a teacher who taught what we call graphic arts, which was like photography and printmaking, t-shirt printing, all these different arts other than like fine arts. And one of the assignments was an animation assignment, and I just really took the class to do that assignment. Though the other stuff was cool too. But finally, that assignment comes along, and he says, "Okay, we're gonna do this." And a lot of the students would just do cutout paper or clay, and I was like, "I want to do a hand-drawn animated short or piece." And he was like, "Well, I don't know how to teach you that, but here's a book." so, and so I looked at the book. I figured it out. He had a slide table
Sure.
that had a light, a light box table, not raked like an animation table, but like flat. And I made a registration thing with rulers, and I just started drawing. And then for 2 weeks, the assignment, or 3 weeks, was the thing, and I didn't finish. And he's like, "Well, you're the only person in my class who actually works and does the work." As it was kind of a pothead class. It was like these
Okay.
kids would take it to like as a blow off class. I just kept, he's like, "Just keep working on it." So the rest of my junior year, I worked on this animated piece. And I took graphic arts too. And he was like, "Well, you still haven't finished your film." And so my whole senior year, I worked on this as well. So his teacher, Mr. Schmaltz is his name. He, uh, he basically gave me an animation class in high school. So I made this film. I never really finished it, but I submitted it to California Institute of the Arts, with a bunch of other drawings, my cartoons I had drawn and all that stuff, in a box. I didn't put it into a portfolio, just dumped it all in a box, mailed it off to Cal Arts, and then I got into Cal Arts, which was my only, at the time, was the only one of two animation schools in North America that taught drawn animation or character animation, and that was California Institute of the Arts and Sheridan in Canada. And I
Hmm.
was like, only school I applied to was Cal Arts, and I was like, if I don't get in, I'll find a day job, I'll work somewhere, and I'm going to apply next year, and I'll just keep applying until I get in. So that was my goal, and luckily the first year I got in, I applied.
Man, so then you came out to Cal Arts basically right from high school, I'm assuming?
Yeah, right from high
Okay.
school. At that time, prior to my year, they only took 25 students, and then my year, it blew up to 36 students. And the upperclassmen were all like, "Oh, this place is going to hell." Letting everybody in. But yeah, in my class too, I had Pete Doctor, who now runs Pixar Animation. A lot of great story people came out of that class, and animators. And then the second most pivotal person was Joe Ranft, who was one of the best story artists who ever lived and worked in the business, and unfortunately died too young. So Joe, I was in his first story class he ever did, and he introduced to me this idea of story development or storyboarding in animation. Because when I went to the school, and what I had learned about animation was animation, like you were an animator and that's what you did. And I didn't realize there were these other things that made up these films, other jobs. So Joe introduced me to storyboarding in this process, and these great storyboard artists that had worked at Disney, like Bill Peet and Joe Rinaldi, and these wonderful draftsmen and just story minds. And so I went, wow, I want to do this. This is really exciting. And you create the thing that will be animated and created. You are in that at that early stage. So that got me jazzed to do that. And then the other thing, my roommate was in live action, and so he would tell me about these live action courses, and so I was able to take a few of them as extra courses. And it was taught by this great Ealing director, Alexander McKendrick, who had directed in the US. He directed a Tony Curtis movie called Sweet Smell of Success. And in England, he had directed the original Lady Killers, Man in the White Suit, and just these great films. And so he ran the film department, and he gave a course on dramatic structure. And I would take that, and he loved animators because he would storyboard his films before, like Hitchcock storyboarded his, or because he came out of advertisement and he brought storyboarding to it. So he loved animators because we could draw. And in one class, he was like really pissed off at all the live action dudes, because they were looking at their short films. I couldn't use any of the live action equipment, because cameras and stuff, because I was not in the school, that department. But I'd sit in on these classes. And so he was ripping them a new one. Like, he thought all their stuff was shit. And so he's like, now, the only animator to come out of CalArts, or the only filmmaker to come out of CalArts, was an animator. And he was talking about Tim Burton, who had gone.
Wow, right. He's still doing well.
Yeah, and now there's been some others, like James Mangold's come out of CalArts.
Sure.
Actually, that was prior to me too, so he kind of messed that up. But I don't know, maybe James Mangold hadn't done anything at that point. Anyway, all the students, all these live action students, just turned to me like with like daggers in their eyes. It was like the one animator in the class.
Yeah.
But Sandy was a big impact in going to these live action classes, because then I started going, well, why? There's all these amazing stories told in live action, different kinds, and diversity, and mysteries, and crime, and love stories, and all these different things. And I went, why don't we tell these kinds of stories in animation? Like, we could do that. And it's always like these Disney type films, or eventually be more musicals and all that stuff. And I was like, no, it could be so much more. So that kind of fueled me, and this idea of story development, to do story and try to push the mold more. And then the next thing that happened at CalArts was Brad Bird came in, and
Yeah.
he was a friend of our animation teacher, Chris Buck. And he had made a short piece for Spielberg called Family Dog, and was part of Amazing Stories. And when I got to school, it had shown that summer, and that first year of school, everybody was talking about it, but I hadn't seen it. And then they showed it at school, and he came in, and like to give us a talk. And he came in a like a leather duster, like a cowboy, like
That's
awesome,
awesome.
like a gunslinger. He's up there talking. He's like, "Hey man," he's showing us all these films from like Sweet Smell, like Touch of Evil, Stagecoach, like all these different like old movies. He's not showing us animation, and he's going, "Hey, man, we can do this in animation, man. We can like do these kind of camera moves. We can tell these stories. Why are we doing that? That's what we need to do." And I'm sitting in this going, "Oh my God, this is like Messiah coming down from the mountain, it's like Moses giving me the tablets." And I was just
Right.
like, that's what I want to do. So all these elements came together, and I was just, I'm going to go in the story. And that's what I then just directed myself to at school.
It seems like for 36 people, they seem to pick a good group of 36 that you were in.
Yeah, they did.
Uh,
No, it was good. Well, 36, they had to be really choosy with who they
sure.
brought in. So it was a good group. Yeah. And then the second year, my sophomore year, they brought in 25 again. And then the junior year, they brought in like 65 or something.
Wow.
They really accelerated it. So anyway, yeah. I don't know how many they bring in now, but
Yeah. So then when you graduate, or I'm assuming you graduate and go right to Disney in the story department.
yeah, pretty much. I mean, it was a little bit of a gap there of just like maybe half a year or so. Yeah, but I got hired into Disney.
Like how like, if you don't mind, like how you sort of like, were it contacts you made at college, or was it stuff post college, or that sort of let
How
you
did I
break
get
into?
there?
Sure.
Yeah, I got out of school. I had to portfolio, so I'd send my portfolio around, or I'd carry actually, that you just carry your portfolio, you'd get like an interview at different studios. And there wasn't a lot of studios at this time, basically
Mhm.
doing feature animation. You had Disney, Don Bluth Animation, made like Fievel Goes West and
Oh
American
yeah,
Tail. Oh, well, eventually I
classic.
worked on Fievel Goes West.
Yeah, that's I love that one.
Do you like that one?
When I was little, yeah, that was my sister and I would watch that.
That was not actually done by Don Bluth. It was done by Spielberg, called
Okay.
Emblemation. And Spielberg had produced the original American Tail.
Mm.
And so this was the sequel. And I actually worked on it because my junior year, with my live action buddy, my roommate, we traveled Europe. We like
Uh-huh.
took got a study abroad and went around Europe. And our mentor we had to have was, we'd have some mentor over in Europe. And so I was able, through animation, and one of his teachers at CalArts set us up with this producer who was on Fievel Goes West at Amblimation. His name was Steve Hickner. and he was like our mentor. So when we were all done, it was that summer from traveling, I went to Steve and I was like, hey, I'd love to stay. Is there a way I can work here? And he's like, oh yeah, man. Oh yeah, we'll have you do a little test. And so I did a test for an in-between job, in-betweening animation. And he hired me, but he's like, well, I can't hire you as an in-betweener because anybody could do that. But I'll hire you as an assistant animator. so, so I got a promotion before I
Job,
was
yeah.
even,
That's
which
awesome.
is still you're in-betweening, but it was a little higher level.
Sure.
So then I worked on Fievel Goes West. So it was kind of my first big professional job was that in-betweener. But then, yeah, how I got into Disney. So I had some friends from my class who actually got hired as animators there, and they connected me. And I was going around with this portfolio prior to that, and every reaction I got was like, "Oh, well, here's another Cal Arts guy with the same portfolio we see." Remember, because we would put in our assignments, so there were all these, the same assignments were in here and stuff like character design and the way we would do it.
Right.
So I was like, oh man, I can't get a job. So I basically threw out the entire portfolio and redid it.
Hmm.
And I basically was like, took a children's book and I did a little bit of a storyboard, like as if you were going to make that children's book into a movie. I did more drawing, went to the zoo, like just drew life studies, but more focused on stories, like, or personalities from like what the animal would sort of evoke to you. Like a rhino would seem old or like heavy or big. So you'd try to find storytelling images and storyboards and stuff and put that more in focus and portfolio. So I made it more personal. And they connected me with a Ed Gombert, who was one of the lead story people at Disney. And he was gracious enough to look at my portfolio. So I would show him what I was working on. He would give me input. I'd go back and rework it, come back and show him. So eventually, they opened up looking for artists again, and I had Ed there to kind of advocate for me. I also lucked out because they were staffing up for two features, The Lion King and Pocahontas. So they needed artists.
Hmm.
So it was a matter of being able to put myself out there and meet people and talk to people, and then timing, which I tell students all the time. I'm like, really, it's about who you know, timing, and then talent.
Hmm.
It's kind of in that order. So
It's definitely who you know.
that's what got me there, and I came in as an assistant animator, or assistant, like apprentice story artist, I guess is what you could call it. And the first project I got on was actually Fantasia 2000. I went right into development on that, and worked on a sequence that didn't make it into the final film. And I did that for a few months and met Joe Grant, who was this amazing, also story god at Disney, who had worked with Walt
Wow.
early on from Snow White. And Joe lived to be almost 100. He died at 98, just a handful of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I met him, and he was awesome. He'd bring me in these books of artists, and he'd go, "Hey, Joe." I don't know if he called everybody Joe or he thought my name was Joe, but he's like, "Joe, these books, these artists you should look at." And he always have a little card he'd write from Joe, like he'd leave more books for me, and he did it in this beautiful calligraphy, and it was so
Wow.
like classy. And he'd leave these books, and it was like Heinrich Clay and like these artists who I never had heard of at that point, and just blew my mind. And I read about him later on in these books that had come out, and I found out that's what he would do to artists like way back when, like in the 40s and stuff. He would bring in books and int- sorry, he would introduce artists to other artists, like, you should look at this guy, you should think about this. So that really was like touching to me when I found out about that, because I was like, wow, I was part of that legacy now with him. So that was cool. So I was on that for a bit, the Fantasia piece, and then Lion King, I got moved to Lion King. And Lion King at the time was like the project nobody wanted to go on to.
Really
Yeah, it was the troubled project, and
interesting.
they were switching out the directors, and they were in a big bind, and it was really like not good. And everybody wanted to go to Pocahontas because it had this beautiful artwork and it was really cool looking and stuff like that. And it was just a little bit not quite as far along as Lion King was, and not in the like doldrums of story and like trying to figure itself out. But and so I'm like, damn, I'm going to I'm going to Lion King. So, but then I went to Lion King, and then again, I had a great mentor, Bernie Mattinson, who also went back to the days of Walt. He came in a little later, around Sleeping Beauty, and so the 50s. But Bernie was great because again, he was like this touchstone to the old time. This older man, probably my age now, and he was great. He was just like the mentor you'd want, like an Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of guy, really calm, perfect. There was one point I got the assignment to work on the part where it's Simba and Mufasa. It's the last time they'll see each other. It's right before the stampede, and Simba had just been in the graveyard, the elephant graveyard with the hyenas, and had disobeyed his father. So this was this middle little sequence where basically Mufasa was going to reprimand him and thing. And all I got was this little paragraph. It wasn't scripted yet. I just got this little paragraph, and it basically described the scene, and said it's like the courtship of Eddie, like a courtship of Eddie's father moment. And I don't know if you remember this show, but this was a show when I was growing up early. That was about do you remember the show? Did you ever?
I remember reading the title. I don't think we ever watched it though. I do remember seeing the title though in the past.
Okay, so every episode of that would end where they were walking off, like in the forest. It's sort of like a really wide shot, really long, like they're like kind of in the distance, but you'd hear them, and the kid would always ask, "Dad, why do people have to die?" Or like he'd have some like question about the universe, and
A
then the dad
profound
would have
question.
this little, explanation for it, or like words of wisdom for him. So they were like, "That's what this moment's like." So I kind of understood it, and then I freaked out because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to start, and so I went to Bernie, and I'm like, "Bernie, I just got this. Like, this is all I got. What do I do?"
Yeah.
He's like, I'm freaking out, and he's just like, Jim, calm down. Start with what you know. And that little bit of advice I've like held on to forever now, and I tell students all the time, because it's like an atomic bomb, that question, that like thing. So basically at that moment I knew they had already worked out that Mufasa was going to come down as a ghost. There were these beautiful storyboards done by Chris Sanders for that. So that was already happening. I knew he had just come from the graveyard. I knew this was the last time Simba was going to see his dad, and the next time he'd see him as a ghost. So I was like, okay, how do I know I have to tie this scene into that scene later? And so had done research about African tribes, and some do believe their ancestors are in the sky and the stars. So I wrote that into it. I just wrote the kings of the past are in the sky and in the stars, and I'll always be there for you. So I pitched it. I like did a rough board of it, and I pitched it to the directors, and they were just like, "Oh my god, you solved this for us. This is fantastic." So at that moment, I became like like the upstart like storyboard young guy. I was the youngest artist at that time, storyboard artist. So they were just like, wow, this Jim Capobianco is like gonna move mountains and stuff. So that was really exciting. That was cool to have that happen.
Yeah, I mean that's great. So you're in that spot after, so the project comes out, right? And obviously Lion King became this international success, and
Yeah.
like what was it for you that was sort of a springboard to, okay, now I've kind of, all these years of college or whatever I've been working up till, this is, now I know this is my path, I'm sticking with it, and I want to, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I knew this was what I wanted to do since, like I was saying, since Cal Arts. And then, yeah, it just kept building on itself. Like the people I was meeting and working with, and, and the impact I was starting to have on these films. And it's something I always embraced, like really, again, trying to think constructively about stories and how to push them in new directions. And it like would get me into trouble too. I got assigned to Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I got the book. I actually had an appendicitis at the end, like
Oh,
while I was on Lion King.
yeah.
So I was out for a couple of weeks, and then I was told while I was out, oh, you're going to move off of Lion King to Hunchback. And I was like, oh, wow, that's cool. I love that story. And I got the book and I read the book. And I was like, oh my God, there's all these funny moments in there and neat characters and stuff. There's a scene in there where Quasimodo's in front of a judge and the judge can't hear him. He's deaf. Quasimodo's deaf, and they're having this like conversation, and it's hilarious. And so I'm like, oh, that's going to be a great animated scene. Oh my God. Like I'm looking at this and getting so excited about it. Then I get in, I read the first draft of the script. They had a script written, and I was like, wow, none of this is in there.
Oh
And it
no.
was a musical and like all this stuff, and I was just like, wait a minute, why aren't they telling the story in the book? So I kept like bringing that up a lot, and I didn't really want to hear that. So and really pushing for it, and like the boards I would do, they give me an assignment, but I would sort of like tweak them into a different direction, and then they didn't like that. And so I was trying to push against the system a bit, and then yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't bode well for me there because I wasn't falling in line. So
Right.
that was the beginning of my end at Disney, I think, to some extent.
Yeah, like I was gonna say, which kind of leads to right Pixar, and I'm assuming right, maybe Bugs Life kind of time,
Yes, that's
late
right.
'90s. So what was that transition like? Is maybe you were sort of okay, I'm a little bit over this here, and like you said, you're trying to do your own thing and kind of push your own, you know, you're where you see things going in terms of the creative process, but the transition to Pixar, like what was that like? Obviously, when it was in during the formative years.
Yeah, no, it was exciting. So like I said earlier, I've been always was trying to push against what was usually done in animation. So that was kind of getting me in trouble at Disney. So then Toy Story had come out, and it was cool. You're like, whoa, look at this new thing these guys are doing. And I wasn't really too much into computer animation, but the storytelling was great. It was sort of like leaning into like telling like a more sophisticated story with animation and in a live with live action kind of sensibilities to it in a way. So I was like, wow, this is cool. So Joe Ranft again, who I mentioned earlier, he kind of had this deal where he worked at Pixar. He actually worked on Nightmare Before Christmas, and he had worked on he was still working with Disney. So he had like this, he's crossed all these like
Yeah.
companies. And he saw my boards from Tin Soldier. So I kept jumping into Fantasia between all the projects I did at Disney, and I was there for 5 years. So he saw my storyboards on Tin Soldier, and he said, well, you've gotten really good. If you want to come to Pixar, you should think about it. I was like, oh, all right. So like, I don't know, a couple of days later, I called him up, and I'm like, so you were talking about Pixar. He's like, well, how much longer do you have on your contract? I got a year. It's like, well, call me in a year. I can't poach you. So I called him back in a year, and when I called him, he was like, oh my God, I can't believe you called me. Holy crap, this is amazing. I was like, well, all right, great. He's like, I'm flying you up here next week. So it turned out one of the storyboard artists, this guy Jorn Klubian, who was also a rock star, like a real rock star
Oh,
in Denmark. Like he
okay.
was like aha level. I don't know
No
if you know
kidding.
that at that period, like the 80s. He was huge. So
That's
he would, and he
incredible.
loved it, but he was also an animator. Like I had worked with him on Lion King. He was a storyboard artist and animator. So he had worked on the hyena song that they did, the like Nazi like march
Mhm.
song. And so Yorn, I think he would go animate, work in animation, then he'd leave to go be a rock star. So I
Yeah.
think that's what happened. He was on Bug's Life, and then he told Joe, "Oh, I got to be a rock star now," and he left. so I called, like, I imagine he said that to Joe, walked out of his office, and then the phone rang and Joe
That's
picked it up
great.
and he's like, holy crap, I can't believe, because it was such a huge reaction.
Yeah.
So then I flew up the next week and I met with him and Andrew Stanton, and who's the co-director on Bugs Life with John Lasseter. And they hired me on the spot. Andrew hired me right away. And so I came up in February of the 97. And then, yeah, it was great. I worked on, that was my beginning of my career there.
I mean, Pixar, right? Like, because you had to fly, for people listening, you were flying from LA basically to the Bay Area.
Yeah, just an hour flight. Yeah, it was easy. So I went up just for the day. I actually played hooky from,
Oh, no.
they didn't know I was
Yeah,
going.
sick day.
Now they do. Yeah, no, they didn't know, and it was a little prior to my contract being totally done, so I had to sneak out. But I
Sure.
did that. Yeah, it was just
Wh-
like flew up, came back, right back down, and then yeah, and it was cool. I mean, in that time, yeah, and Pixar was so super exciting because I mean, and it wasn't a done deal. I mean, it was like they had done one movie.
Yeah.
We're now in their second film. Would it be successful? Steve Jobs was basically like paying for everything at this point,
Mhm.
like making sure the company stayed afloat. So the next film could have tanked and it maybe would have sunk the studio. So it was a risky thing. My now wife, girlfriend at the time, moved up with me, Kim Collins, who now works at Pixar. She's now a producer there. So yeah, so it was a bit of a roll of the dice, but it was exciting, and it was such a maverick studio. They were like really pushing against everything Disney was doing. They even had a list of things that were like, we will not do sequels, we will not do musicals, we will not do, forgot the other things, but those are two that I remember because you're like, eventually sequels with Toy Story 2 went out,
I was
kind
gonna
of out the
say,
window.
yeah. A couple
That
years
was only
later.
done as a sequel because
Sure.
Disney wanted to do a direct to video. So they were like,
Oh,
all
no
right, we'll
way.
do it. So
Right.
part of the deal, I think, with Steve was like, okay, we'll do it that way. But then it was so turning out so well, they decided let's turn it into a theatrical feature, and then, but that was the only sequel they did until Disney bought them, and
Yeah.
then all the sequels started happening.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great film. There's very few sequels. Godfather, couple
Yeah,
franchises where you can pull a sequel and it's almost as good as the first.
very true. Yeah, yeah. No, some people have told me they like it better, which I'm like, really? Okay.
Yeah, no, I
I
mean,
mean,
I
Toy Story is my favorite because I have no luggage. I wasn't there.
true.
All the other films from my period there, even if I didn't quite work on them, there's like memories of it, and it's like I know how the sausage was made, so
Yeah, yeah.
it's a less like pure. Like Toy Story to me is great because I had nothing to do with it.
Right. So, and before we get to like sort of your, I guess, reunion of sorts with Brad on
Sure.
Ratatouille, like what were those years like as you just kind of came aboard at Pixar? Like, was it a different culture or
Yeah, for
sounds
sure.
obviously with the business, Steve Jobs and everyone involved in it, but in terms of your role there.
Yeah, it was really exciting because what Pixar put forward was story. Their whole thing was story is king, and their whole thing was like everything, the story matters. It's the only thing that matters. At Disney, I think because of its history, Walt was always the story guy. Like
Yeah.
it all revolved around Walt. Even Joe Grant, who I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
he actually became really pivotal in story telling and actually was kind of like the second Walt in the early days. And they actually had later on a falling out because Joe was getting too big for Walt,
Mm.
and Walt got like kind of pushed him out in ways. And later on, Bill Pete, who I also mentioned, kind of did the same thing. So Walt really controlled story. What was really elevated there, like the Nine Old Men, maybe people have heard about that, and the animation there was held up. So even when I was there in the more modern age or the second Renaissance beginning, it was the animators were king. Like they were the top level. And the story artists were much more like, oh yeah, yeah, you story guys. And it wasn't really I mean it was somewhat, important, but the writers were more important. The story teams weren't so much. And it was being taken over by Hollywood in a way, and this new philosophy, a way Hollywood works and stuff. But
Right.
at Pixar, story was the number one, and so we were like the fighter pilots or something. We really were like the Top Guns. So that was really exciting, and especially because they really took stories so seriously, and to this day still do, and the amount of reels. Because I was impressed by, at Disney we would do our storyboards, and then I got to Pixar and they did twice as many drawings as we did at Disney, and I was like, whoa. And they actually also were using After Effects, really early After Effects, as doing camera moves and stuff with the boards, which we didn't do at Disney at all, because it would go to the layout department, and they would figure all that stuff out. So I was like, whoa, look at all this work they put in these storyboards.
Meticulous.
Very meticulous, like really like, and today, I mean, it's crazy. It's even more than we did back then. So, and part of that's because of the computer, but I was just like, wow. So yeah, their whole philosophy was different and I think it showed. I mean, those first films, one after another, were like outdoing each other. It was kind of like Disney when I was first there, because you had the same thing happening. Little Mermaid to Aladdin to, although I missed Rescuers Down Under there, didn't do as well. But you had these films like doing better, and then and Pixar just like picked up that baton and like just started doing that with each film. So it was really exciting. It was like I said, the Maverick Studio, it really had this mission that we're going to do animation totally different. And and they were inventing computer animation. I mean, I was just there today, dropping off my wife's computer that she forgot at home.
Yeah.
Raced over there, and I was talking to their head of PR, and they're having a big event there today because they created Render Man, and they're doing a big event there celebrating that. And you realize that Pixar, it was huge. I mean, they all this CG animation we see today is because of these guys. I mean, and so every film they were going, okay, this film we're going to tackle water. This film we're going to tackle hair. This film, like they would always have like some big thing that were like, okay, we're going to figure this out for this movie. And it was really cool. It was cool to be around that. I didn't understand any of that in my world, but it was neat to be around all that,
So when leading up to Ratatouille, right? Like, how did that whole, interaction? Obviously, you met Brad at CalArts, right?
I
But
didn't really meet him. I just saw
yeah,
him up on.
you were in the classroom.
Yeah. Is in his
So
aura.
like, yeah, right. So like, how does like could you like share the story of like how that came about and sort of you being part of crafting the story for this film that's just like a beloved classic, Academy Award nomination, best original screenplay. Like how did that come about from like you just joining the company to a few years later you're in this spot?
Yeah, so from Pug's Life, I went on to Finding Nemo. Well, actually, went on to Toy Story 2, and then Finding Nemo, and did the shark sequence there. And the prior two films, Bug's Life and Toy Story, I also like reworked their third acts for them, and they had two different third acts that weren't very great. And so I was like, what would make these better? And so I would just come up with the new things. And then like Toy Story, the head of story, and then one of the story artists, we were like, why don't they go to the airport? They don't. It was the original version. They just had a road chase, and then Al got to the airport, but they got Woody back before Al went to the airport. So we were like, why don't they go to the airport? And like, we have the final sequence there. So I was free. So I reboarded it and said, what if we do it this way? And John Lasseter was like, this is the way we have to do it. And Bug's Life, I similarly on my own went, why don't we fly up into the tree? They had this other thing and do his chase through the tree and make it more exciting. And I reboarded it and showed Joe, and he's like, oh my God, we just showed John and Andrew. So I started getting this, like I labeled the third act guy because I had done these two third acts. And Andrew, who I'd worked on Bug's Life, he pulled me onto Nemo as his first artist on there, and started helping develop it. And then he scripted it and said, what do you guys want to do, when we brought the story team on? And I was like, read the shark sequence, and I'm like, I want to do the sharks. I want to draw sharks. I drew them as a kid. I get paid to draw sharks. Hell yeah.
So cool.
And actually I was surprised nobody else picked the sequence. So I ended up just developing the whole shark sequence and reworking it even from what the script was, because that didn't work at first. So I'd done all this stuff, and then Jan Pinkava I met in development when I was with Andrew on beginning of Nemo, and Jan had just directed Jerry's Game, won the Academy Award for it. So he was kind of the first director they were tapping who wasn't in the core group who made Toy Story. So Jan pitched this idea called about I was brought on as the first artist with Jan, and he hands me this outline across the table. So Jan was the first director, Jan Pinkava, so people know. And he hands me this piece of paper, and I read it, and it's a rat who wants to cook in Paris. And I'm like, what the hell? How do we make this a cinematic movie? And this is the craziest idea I've ever heard. So I basically said to Jan, I think we have to do like kind of a Monty Python thing with this. We have to make this so whacked to make it funny and pull it off. And he's like, yes, let's do it. And he had trouble with his other writers. He had a few writers, and he didn't gel with anybody. They weren't kind of getting what he wanted to do. And I basically said to him, I think we should write this. I think you need to write it. We should write it together. And he was like, really, Jim? You think we can? I'm like, yeah, why not? Let's go for it. And so we wrote the first draft. We tackled it, and I kind of pushed him along to do it. It was a little cavalier on my part because I wanted to get into screenwriting more, because I saw that's where the power was with story. And so, so we wrote the first draft, and I was head of story, and I overlooked all the storyboard artists. So for 5 years, I was like ran the story team with Jan being the director, and we pretty much developed it to a point. The problem with the version we were really working on for a long time was there were so many storylines. Like, we had a lot of things going on, and one of the ones that got cut out was the family line. There was a bigger thing with the family, and also Gusto was alive. Now Brad came on because at one point they were seeing that now for a long time. So when I got on the film, it was like there were so many films lined up to release that I saw that Ratatouille wouldn't get released for like 6 years or something. And I was like, holy shit, this is going to be a long run. So so at first everybody was like, yeah, you guys write the script, guys. And so nobody was paying attention to us, and we're developing it, and we're doing a lot of great work. A lot of it ended up in the movie, or seeded the final version. So there was a lot of development, and the story team was great, but it just, Jan wouldn't like make those final decisions he needed to make. And even though he was great as the inventor of the concept, even though how good that film looks is a testament to him, because he loved the art department. That's where he put a lot of his work, not in the story department. So we eventually, they just saw that Jan can, like, they needed somebody in there who could just finish the movie. And Brad rolled off Incredibles, and they were like, they didn't have any other directors available, and they were like, could you finish it for us? And he was like, agreed to. And it was great, because I think that film, of any film I've experienced, it is really a testament to the three of us who were nominated. Jan came up with this crazy ass idea. I carried it through story with my team to Brad, and then Brad finished it. And this is a film Brad would never make. Even like, he kind of had this antithesis to, or this, like, he didn't want to do a film about animals who talked.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't, he loved the project. Like, he would be in the brain trust notes sessions and like really liked it and would have great notes. He kept pitching that idea that you see in the film now, where he bites on the strawberry and the chocolate, and he puts them together, and you see the like, the images around him, and the light, the colors, and mixing and showing like what the effect it has. He would pitch that almost every brain trust, but Jan never picked up on it. Like, he wouldn't get him feeded and seized. When he took it on, he kind of embraced it in a big way. So it was great, and it was cool to work with him. The only thing is, at that point too, I'd been on it for 5 years, and Brad only works with his story supervisor, Mark Andrews, who had worked on Incredibles, and I knew he would bring Mark on. So I was like, they asked me, they said, well, you could stay on as a storyboard artist and stay. And I was like, man, I've been on this film for so long. So I went to Andrew, who's my mentor, and I said, should I stay or what should I do? And he was like, no, I think you should go to development. You should move off and go to development. And I was like, okay. And so I told him, no, I thank you guys, but I've been on for a long time. And they totally got it, and it was cool. And I went into development with Gary Rydstrom on his project that unfortunately never saw the light of day. It's called The Blue-Footed Newt. But while I was on that, I got asked, or they put out a call for DVD shorts and for Ratatouille, but you couldn't use CG because they needed all the animators for the film. So I had this concept to do an educational. I really loved these Ward Kimball educational things that he did he was a Disney animator, one of the 9 old men, and he did these things called Man in Space series, and they're all these like very stylized animation, and they're edutainment things where they're funny, they're really cool. So I wanted to do something like that, and so I pitched this idea called Your Friend the Rat, that was basically an educational thing about rats and how they dealt with humans, and humans dealt with rats throughout our history together, because we had a very similar history. They've always been with us. So from all the research we did, I learned about this stuff, and the books I read about rats and stuff. So it was things we would never put in the film, but I was like, well, so I pitched this to Brad Bird, and I kind of thought it might sail with him because I knew he would love those films too, the old Ward Kimball things. But for sure. So I pitched it. He really liked it, and then he asked me if I wanted to write it. I said yeah, and then I said sure, I'd like to give it a go. And he's like, yeah, give it a try. So I wrote the script. I brought it to him, and he was like, okay, cut it in half. I was like, well, what should I cut out? I'm like, okay. So I went off and I cut it in half, almost. It's not quite in half, but and he was right. I did know. He didn't tell me, but I did know. It was very cool, and then he liked it. He thought it was cool. So I got to make the first 2D animated piece that Pixar did, and longest short at the time. And we even threw some stop motion in there. It was a blast. That was 1 year from me pitching it to Brad to finishing it. It's probably the best year I had at Pixar. It was really cool. And eventually I could put CG in it because the animators freed up. So they were like, okay, maybe you can open with CG. And then, so that was Brad. He goes, you know what? You got to put CG in it now. And I'm like, well, but is that going to be weird? It's all 2D and stuff. He's like, nah, it'll be cool. Right. All right. I'll put them in the beginning and like seed them through it. And so, yeah, so it's happened. And then all my films that I've done of myself have all been these hybrid pieces, even Mary Poppins. So yeah, so that was my Ratatouille story. So, and then, yeah, it was man, it was like, I didn't expect it at all to get nominated. That was like, I was in Bologna at the time showing, I think, Ratatouille or Your Friend the Rat at a film festival there. And my wife like looked at it, like saw the internet post, and she's like freaking out. And I'm like, I was in bed, like, wait, what's going on? What's happening? It's like, you just got nominated. I'm like, what? I didn't even know I was like up for like considered. So that was really, really special.
Oh yeah. I mean, gosh, that's a huge accomplishment. I mean, especially to find out 9 hours ahead across the world.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's I didn't even think about it at the time, but I mean, animation rarely. I think the only other time it had gotten nominated for screenplay was with Toy Story, I think. So it was really special, really cool.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to part 1 of my interview with Jim Capobianco. Next Thursday will be part 2. Cannot wait for you to listen to it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of Experience Curve. Please take the time to share this podcast with a friend or colleague to help get the word out about my show.